War leaves behind more than spent brass and forgotten graves. Sometimes, it leaves something that doesn't know the war is over. In the early hours of a rain-soaked morning in 2022, a U.S. Army Signals Intelligence Detachment stationed at Camp Sime, a joint U.S.-Thai facility used for rotational training and regional surveillance, reported something that should not have been possible. Their radios, newly issued, encrypted Singer's units, began broadcasting traffic from a frequency that hadn't been used in over 50 years. The voices were American. They used outdated call signs, obsolete grid references, and they kept asking for permission to extract from a jungle that no longer officially existed on any modern map. Most of us are taught that the Vietnam War ended in 1975. The paperwork says so. The monuments say so. But history has a way of leaking through the cracks, especially in places where wars were never meant to be acknowledged in the first place. In 1971, during the height of America's secret war in Laos, an entire long-range reconnaissance platoon attached to a CIA-backed special operations group disappeared during a cross-border insertion. No wreckage was found. No bodies recovered. Officially, the mission never happened. Unofficially, men remembered. They remembered a platoon that walked into the jungle and never came back. They remembered radios that kept transmitting long after their operators were declared dead. And they remembered a forward operating barracks that had to be abandoned because the walls themselves began to speak. This story is told through after-action reports, redacted field journals, and first-person testimonies from soldiers, men who swore oaths, followed orders, and were never trained to explain what followed them home. This isn't a ghost story told around a campfire. This is a story about a platoon that vanished, and a barracks that remembers them. Chapter 1. The barracks that wouldn't stay quiet. I didn't believe in haunted buildings when I arrived at Camp Sime. I believed in faulty wiring, bad sleep cycles, and the kind of stress that makes grown men imagine things they don't want to explain to their chain of command. I'd been in long enough to know that fear usually has a logistical explanation if you dig far enough. What I wasn't prepared for was a building that seemed to already know who we were before we ever stepped inside it. Barracks C-12 sat at the far edge of the compound, close to the tree line. It wasn't marked any differently than the others. Same poured concrete walls, same narrow windows, same faded unit numbers stenciled above the door. But unlike the rest of the barracks, no one lingered near it. The Thai guards posted nearby kept their distance, especially after sunset. When we walked past with our duffels, one of them muttered something under his breath and made a warning gesture I didn't recognize. Our platoon sergeant unlocked the door and said, "Temporary quarters. Don't mess with the wiring." Lights cut out sometimes. That was it. No briefing. No warnings. No history lesson. Inside, the air felt heavy. Not humid in the normal coastal way, but thick, like the building had been sealed too long and was holding its breath. The lights flickered when we flipped the breakers. The walls were bare except for faint discolorations where something had once been mounted and removed. Radios, maybe. Lockers. I remember thinking it looked less like a living space and more like a place people passed through briefly and never returned to. That first night, I woke up thinking someone was calling my name. Not shouting. Not panicked. Just firm, professional. The way you address someone on the net when you expect them to answer. I sat up in my bunk, heart already racing listening. Then I heard it again. Raven 3-1, radio check. Over. The voice wasn't inside my head. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from the wall to my left, right where an old conduit ran down toward the floor. I got out of bed and put my ear close to the concrete. The sound sharpened, clearer than it should have been. Raven 3-1. This is Kingfisher Actual. Say again your last. Over. I stepped back so fast I nearly tripped over my boots. My radio was on the desk, powered down, antenna detached. The building was silent again, like nothing had happened. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I asked around quietly. I didn't want to be the guy crying ghost on day one. But when I mentioned hearing radio traffic, 2 other soldiers froze. One of them said, "You heard it too?" Like he'd been waiting for someone else to say it first. By the third night, it wasn't subtle anymore. At exactly the same time, just after 0200, the transmission started again. This time, they echoed through the entire barracks. Clear, disciplined voices using proper procedure, proper cadence, but wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. The call signs weren't current. The terminology was decades out of date. They referenced grid systems none of us used anymore. We're pinned down. Requesting immediate extraction. How copy? Someone whispered. Who the hell is Raven Platoon? That name hit something buried deep in my memory. I'd heard it once before, years earlier, during a classified briefing that glossed over operations in Laos during the Vietnam era. Missions that officially never happened. Units that weren't supposed to exist. I keyed my radio without thinking. Station calling Raven, identify yourself. The response came instantly, like they'd been waiting. This is Raven 3-1, U.S. Army. We've been holding position for 6 days. You're late. Late. The room went dead quiet. No one laughed. No one moved. The radio in my hand crackled once and went silent, even though it was tuned to a completely different frequency. After that, things escalated fast. Condensation began forming on the walls at night, dripping down in slow, steady rivulets, even when the air conditioning was running. Mud appeared on the floor in the mornings. Dark red clay that none of us could track to the outside. The smell changed too. Damp earth. Rotting vegetation. Jungle, not coastline. One soldier woke up screaming, clawing at his legs, swearing something had wrapped around him in his sleep. Another refused to stay inside after dark. He sat outside the building with his rifle across his knees until sunrise. Eyes locked on the door like he expected it to open on its own. The worst part wasn't the fear. It was the feeling of being observed. Like the barracks wasn't empty, just crowded with something that didn't cast shadows. On the 7th night, the voices came back stronger than ever. Command, this is Raven. We are running out of ammunition. We are running out of men. Then, quieter, almost confused. Why aren't you answering? I realized then that whatever was happening here wasn't replaying a memory. They were still transmitting, and they expected someone to be listening. Chapter 2. Raven Platoon, 1971. Once you hear a voice come through concrete, you don't forget it, especially when that voice sounds trained, disciplined, and scared in a way no recording ever quite captures. After the 7th night, Command couldn't ignore what was happening in Barracks C-12 anymore. Officially, the complaint read, unexplained radio interference. Unofficially, they pulled every classified archive tied to the building and told us not to discuss what we'd heard outside the unit. That's when the name Raven Platoon surfaced for real. The files were old. Paper scans converted to digital, margins chewed up by time. Entire paragraphs blacked out so aggressively it felt intentional, not procedural. Most of the identifiers were gone, but dates remained, locations remained, and enough fragments survived to piece together a picture that didn't want to stay buried. Raven Platoon was a long-range reconnaissance element operating in 1971 during the height of the covert war in Laos. They weren't officially U.S. Army. On paper, they didn't exist at all. They were attached to a special operations group conducting cross-border missions that could never be acknowledged without triggering international consequences. If they succeeded, nobody would know. If they failed, nobody would admit they were there. Their insertion point was deep jungle, far from any established fire support. The terrain notes described triple canopy foliage, so dense aerial surveillance was nearly useless. The platoon's job was simple in theory. Confirm enemy movement along an unmonitored trail network, establish observation posts, and extract quietly within 10 days. They never made it to extraction. The first few days of radio traffic were routine. Position updates, weather reports, requests for resupply that were denied due to airspace restrictions. Then the tone shifted. One after-action fragment quoted a platoon sergeant by name, though the name itself was redacted. The quote wasn't, "Area feels wrong. No wildlife movement. Men reporting auditory hallucinations." Hallucinations. That word appeared several times, usually followed by a blacked-out sentence and a note from higher command recommending psychological evaluation after mission completion. Except the mission never completed. By day 5, Raven Platoon began reporting contact, not with enemy forces, with something else. The reports described movement without visual confirmation, sounds of footsteps pacing their perimeter without triggering trip lines, radios picking up transmissions that didn't match any known friendly or enemy frequencies. One line stopped me cold when I read it. Jungle does not respond correctly to light. No elaboration. No follow-up. Just that sentence, sitting alone in a sea of redacted text. The last confirmed transmission from the platoon was a request for immediate extraction due to environmental compromise. That phrasing didn't exist in standard doctrine at the time. Someone had improvised it because they didn't have language for what they were experiencing. Extraction was denied. Air assets were grounded due to weather, or political pressure, or something else the paperwork didn't say. After that, the transmissions continued without command acknowledgement. Raven Platoon kept calling in situation reports long after anyone was listening. They referenced injuries that didn't match combat wounds, men missing from their positions without signs of struggle, radios malfunctioning but still transmitting. Then abruptly, the jungle went quiet. Search operations were discussed but never executed. Official reasoning cited risk of exposure. Unofficial notes hinted at something more troubling. One handwritten margin note read, "No recoverable terrain." Weeks later, villagers near the Laotian border turned over 6 American radios. They were found stacked neatly on a rock outcropping at the edge of the jungle, arranged with deliberate care. Antennas intact, casings clean, batteries full, despite having supposedly transmitted for days beyond their expected lifespan. No bodies were ever recovered. Raven Platoon was declared lost, presumed killed in action. Their files were sealed and buried under layers of classification designed to discourage curiosity. So why did their voices start transmitting again half a century later? That question haunted all of us in C-12 as we listened to the recordings pulled from the archives. The cadence matched exactly what we'd been hearing at night. Same call signs, same urgency, same calm professionalism layered over something that sounded like creeping confusion. One of the intelligence analysts said quietly, "These aren't loops." He pointed to waveform discrepancies, subtle variations that shouldn't exist in a repeating signal. "These are live transmissions," he said, "or something doing a very good job pretending to be." That's when the realization settled in, heavy and unwelcome. Barracks C-12 hadn't just been built on a base. It had been built as a containment point. After Raven Platoon vanished, a temporary debrief and monitoring site had been established for analysts tasked with listening to the jungle, waiting for something that never officially spoke again. When the transmissions finally stopped in the 70s, the building was quietly repurposed, then abandoned, then reused decades later without explanation. Until us. The voices hadn't followed the jungle to Thailand. They had been waiting exactly where command left them. And now, after all these years, Raven Platoon was still calling for extraction, still expecting orders, still convinced the mission wasn't over. Chapter 3. Voices through concrete. Once the analysts confirmed the transmissions weren't recordings, the tone from higher shifted fast. What had been treated like an equipment anomaly became a controlled situation. We were ordered to remain in Barracks C-12, continue logging incidents, and under no circumstances respond to the voices again. That last part was emphasized more than anything else. Do not engage. Do not answer. Do not acknowledge. That's never easy for soldiers. We're trained to respond to radio traffic. Silence goes against instinct, especially when the calls sound like they're coming from men who know exactly how to speak our language. Every transmission followed proper format. Clear call signs. Correct pauses. Even the stress in their voices sounded authentic. The kind you hear when someone is trying to keep fear out of their tone because others are listening. The building seemed to react to our silence. The voices started coming earlier. Sometimes just after midnight. Sometimes during evening hours when the lights were still on and we were awake. They no longer felt distant. They pressed through the walls, vibrating the concrete lightly, like sound traveling through water. One night, the voice changed. Kingfisher Actual. It said, "Slower now, cautious. We can hear you moving." That did it. A private dropped his notebook. Another soldier whispered, "They know we're here." The next transmission came seconds later. "You're not the ones we left with." The room went cold in a way air conditioning couldn't explain. Not a drop in temperature, but a sensation, like standing too close to deep water at night. The walls began to sweat again, moisture forming in streaks that ran downward like fingerprints dragged through condensation. We started hearing more than voices. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside our sleeping area, heavy and deliberate, always stopping just short of the door. When someone worked up the nerve to open it, the corridor was empty. No shadows, no disturbed dust, nothing. Equipment began malfunctioning in subtle ways. Radios turned on by themselves, tuning to dead frequencies. Headsets crackled with breathing that stopped the moment you removed them. One of the analysts swore he heard someone clearing their throat directly behind him while he was alone in the comms room. The worst incident happened on the 12th night. We were all awake, sitting at our desks, pretending not to listen for the next transmission. When it came, it didn't use a call sign. "Why won't you answer us?" The voice sounded closer than ever, not echoing, not filtered. Raw. I broke orders. I don't remember deciding to do it. My hand moved before my brain caught up. "We can hear you," I said into the radio. "Identify your location." Silence followed, long enough for regret to settle in my gut. Then the reply came, layered with others beneath it, overlapping, like multiple people trying to speak through the same mouth. "We're right here." The lights flickered violently. Lockers rattled. The smell of wet earth flooded the room so strong it made my eyes burn. For a split second, the far wall didn't look like concrete anymore. It looked dense, dark, like foliage pressed too close to see through. A new sound joined the voices. Insects. Not buzzing. Marching. Clicking. Thousands of them. Just out of sight. Someone shouted to cut the power. Another screamed to get out. The door slammed shut on its own with a force that bent the frame. Radios all across the room came alive at once. Different voices shouting over each other. Some calling for medevac. Some crying out names. Some issuing commands none of us recognized. Then one voice rose above the rest. "Hold the perimeter," it ordered. "Do not let it separate us." Just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The lights stabilized. The smell faded. The wall was just a wall again. We sat there, breathing hard, staring at one another like survivors of a blast. Command arrived within the hour. Not base command. Higher. Men who didn't introduce themselves and didn't wear name tapes. They shut down the building, seized our recordings, and escorted us out under armed watch. Barracks C-12 was declared off limits pending evaluation. As we stood outside at dawn, one of the senior officers looked back at the building and said something I wasn't supposed to hear. "They're bleeding through again." That's when I understood the truth we'd been circling. Raven Platoon wasn't haunting the barracks. They were still deployed. Whatever happened to them in that jungle hadn't killed them in any way that mattered. It had trapped them in a space that overlapped with ours, just enough for radios and voices to pass through. The barracks wasn't cursed. It was a relay point, a place where the mission never ended. As we were loaded into transport vehicles, I heard one last transmission echo faintly from inside the sealed building. "Command," the voice said, exhausted but steady. "We're still holding. Please advise." No one answered. And as the trucks pulled away, I realized something that still keeps me awake years later. If they could hear us moving, how long had they been listening before we ever heard them? Chapter 4. The jungle that followed them home. They moved us into temporary quarters on the opposite side of the base. But distance didn't bring relief. If anything, it made the silence worse. Barracks C-12 stayed dark, ringed with temporary fencing and warning placards that didn't explain anything. Guards were posted at all hours, yet none of them would stand directly in front of the entrance. They formed a loose semicircle instead, weapons angled outward, as if the threat wasn't inside trying to escape, but something beyond the walls trying to get back in. The official explanation given to us was structural instability. Unofficially, we were told to keep our mouths shut and our observations documented. Debriefs were conducted one-on-one. Same questions every time. What did you hear? What did you smell? Did you see anything that could not be explained? Did you respond to the transmissions? I answered honestly. That turned out to be a mistake. The first sign that C-12 hadn't let us go came 2 nights later. I woke to the sound of rain hitting metal, even though the forecast called for clear skies. The noise was steady, rhythmic, too close. When I sat up, I realized it wasn't rain at all. It was dripping from my ceiling. Dark droplets fell onto the floor, leaving small splashes that smelled unmistakably of wet soil. Not sewage, not rust, earth. I wiped one with my finger and stared at the red-brown smear on my skin. Laotian clay, if I had to guess, though I had no way of proving that. Others experienced it too. One soldier found leaves in his boots when he woke up, long, narrow jungle leaves that none of the landscaping on base matched. Another reported vines pressing against his window from the outside, only to find bare concrete when he pulled the curtain back. The radios came next. Even in the new barracks, with different wiring and different power grids, our equipment began picking up interference. It wasn't constant. It came in bursts, always at night, always faint, like a signal struggling to push through layers of static and time. We're still moving. A voice whispered through my headset one evening as I monitored a routine channel check. But the jungle won't open. I froze, fingers hovering over the controls. That transmission didn't come from C-12. It came from inside the base network. Command denied it, of course. They said stress was causing auditory hallucinations. They offered counseling and early rotation for anyone who requested it. No one did. We all understood that leaving wouldn't stop whatever it started. It would just mean facing it alone. A week later, one of the Thai guards assigned near the sealed barracks went missing. His rifle was found propped against the fence, safety engaged. There were footprints in the dirt leading toward the tree line behind C-12, then nothing. No sign of struggle. No blood. Just a sudden absence where a man had been standing minutes earlier. That night, the transmissions returned in force. Not from the walls this time, but from every unsecured radio on base. The voices overlapped, layered and chaotic, yet somehow organized, like a unit trying to maintain discipline under impossible conditions. We've lost perimeter integrity. They're taking men one at a time. Stay together. Don't let the jungle isolate you. The phrase repeated across multiple channels, spoken by different voices, all carrying the same warning. The jungle isolates. I realized then that Raven Platoon wasn't describing terrain anymore. They were describing a behavior. Whatever they'd encountered in Laos didn't attack all at once. It separated, confused, waited. It learned how soldiers think, how they rely on spacing, on visual contact, on radio communication. And when it couldn't fully cross into our world, it brought pieces of its environment with it instead. Moisture, soil, sound. Command finally authorized a controlled re-entry into Barracks C-12. I was part of the team assigned to monitor from outside while specialists went in. They wore full protective gear, respirators, sealed suits more appropriate for chemical hazards than structural inspections. The moment they crossed the threshold, their body cams began to distort. Audio dropped in and out, replaced by low-frequency noise that made my teeth ache. One of them muttered, "It's darker inside than it should be," even though the lights were on. Then he said something none of us were prepared for. "There are trees in here." The feed cut out immediately after. When the team emerged 10 minutes later, shaken and pale, they refused to elaborate. One of them sat on the ground and vomited. Another kept rubbing his arms like something was still crawling on him. Barracks C-12 was reclassified on the spot. No more inspections. No more monitoring from inside. The building was declared permanently sealed, slated for eventual demolition that everyone quietly knew would never happen. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The final transmission I personally heard came 3 nights after the failed inspection. It broke through my headset softly, almost apologetically. "We didn't mean to bring it with us," the voice said. "We just didn't know how to leave it behind." I recognized the speaker. Raven 3-1. The same voice that had told me I was late. Then, quieter still, "If you can hear this, don't come looking." The signal faded, leaving only static and the distant sound of insects, marching in a pattern that felt deliberate. The next morning, Command issued transfer orders for our entire detachment. Camp Samaisan would continue operations without us. Barracks C-12 would remain sealed, its history unrecorded, its purpose denied. As our transport lifted off, I looked down at the base shrinking beneath us and felt a certainty settle in my chest. The jungle hadn't followed Raven Platoon home. They had brought the mission with them. And missions like that don't end just because the war does. Chapter 5. Extraction denied. The order came down without ceremony. No briefing. No explanation. Just a short directive pushed through the chain like a body slid under a door. Our detachment was to prepare for immediate redeployment. Equipment only. No personal effects left behind. No return to Barracks C-12 under any circumstances. That alone told me everything Command wasn't willing to say. Extraction usually feels like relief. This one felt like abandonment. Not ours. Theirs. As we packed, radios across the base began cycling power on and off without being touched. Green indicator lights blinked in unison, like something testing a perimeter. I remember standing in the motor pool watching 3 separate vehicles light up their comms simultaneously, each one tuning itself to a dead frequency. Then the voice came back. Not loud, not urgent, resigned. "Command," Raven 3-1 said, "we acknowledge delay. We'll hold." That transmission didn't come from Barracks C-12. It came from everywhere. Vehicle radios, handhelds, fixed stations. Even a field phone that hadn't been plugged in since before I arrived rang once and went silent. I saw a lieutenant reach for his handset and hesitate, his hand hovering inches from the receiver. He looked at the senior officer beside him, searching for permission. The officer shook his head once. Do not engage. Those words mattered more than doctrine now. As night fell, the air changed again. The same heavy pressure we'd felt inside C-12 settled over the base, muting sound, bending distance. Floodlights illuminated patches of ground that didn't look right, shadows pooling where they shouldn't, as if the light itself was being absorbed. A perimeter guard fired a warning shot into the tree line behind the sealed barracks. He swore he'd seen movement, something tall and slow, shifting just beyond the fence. The thermal cameras picked up nothing, but the jungle answered anyway. Not with gunfire, with radios. We're losing cohesion, a voice crackled. Men are disappearing between positions. Another voice cut in, tighter, strained. This isn't terrain. It's hunting. Those words rolled through the base like a pressure wave. Every soldier listening understood the implication. Terrain doesn't adapt. Terrain doesn't learn spacing, patterns, call, and response. What Raven Platoon had encountered was something that observed first and acted later. Command made the call to shut down all non-essential transmissions. Radios were powered off. Antennas removed. Frequencies scrubbed. For a few minutes, it worked. The night grew quiet again, unnaturally so. Then the voice came through without a carrier wave. Not over radio. Inside. We see you packing. Raven 3-1 said calmly. That means extraction is coming, right? I felt the words more than I heard them, like someone speaking directly into the space behind my eyes. Around me, others froze, heads snapping up, faces pale. No, someone whispered. No, no, no. The reply came gently, almost understanding. That's okay. We've waited before. The perimeter alarms tripped all at once. Motion sensors lit up behind C-12, then went dead. The ground near the fence darkened, soil turning wet and glossy under the lights. Something pressed against the concrete wall from the inside. Not hard enough to crack it, just enough to outline shapes that didn't resemble human silhouettes anymore. Branches. Limbs. Too many joints. One of the senior officers finally spoke into an open channel, voice steady but tight. Raven elements. This is U.S. Army Command. Mission terminated. Stand down. For a moment, there was no response. Then laughter crackled through the speakers. Not mocking. Tired. Sir, Raven 3-1 replied. We can't. The officer swallowed. Explain. There was a pause, longer than before, filled with faint ambient noise. Wind through leaves. Insects. Something wet dragging across soil. The jungle won't let go, the voice said. It learned us. If we stop moving, it takes us apart. Another voice joined in, weaker. Extraction's not a place anymore. That's when the understanding hit me, sharp and cold. Raven Platoon wasn't asking to leave Laos. They were asking to leave the condition they were trapped in. The radios flared one last time. Every frequency spiked. Overlapping transmissions collapsing into a single channel. Command. Raven 3-1 said, voice cracking for the first time. We're out of time. Request permission to extract now. Silence followed. Not because Command didn't hear them. Because Command didn't know where extraction would even be. After several long seconds, the response finally came, routed through layers of authority, stripped of emotion. Negative, the officer said. Extraction denied. The reaction was immediate. The lights around Barracks C-12 went out simultaneously. Not flickered. Out. Darkness swallowed that side of the base. The smell of wet earth surged, stronger than ever, and the sound of insects rose to a roar that drowned out shouted orders. Then it stopped. Everything did. No radios. No insects. No movement. When power was restored minutes later, Barracks C-12 was unchanged from the outside. Sealed. Silent. Empty. But the base felt different. Lighter. Like pressure had been released. We finished packing at first light. No one spoke about what had happened. We didn't need to. The order was clear. The situation was contained, at least for now. As I boarded the transport, my handheld radio chirped once, despite being powered off. A final transmission slipped through, barely audible. We'll hold, Raven 3-1 said. That's what we do. Then nothing. As the aircraft lifted, I realized the Truth Command would never put in a report. Raven Platoon wasn't waiting for rescue anymore. They were holding the line, keeping whatever learned them from learning us next. Chapter 6. After the silence. Silence sounds different after something answers you. When we redeployed, command treated it like a routine relocation. New billets, new mission set, new faces who didn't ask questions. Officially, Barracks C-12 never existed as anything other than a decommissioned structure with minor electrical issues. Camp Samasan continued operations without interruption. On paper, nothing unusual occurred. But for those of us who had lived inside that building, the quiet that followed wasn't comforting. It felt conditional, temporary, like the pause between radio checks when you know the other end is still keyed, just not speaking. The transmissions stopped completely after the extraction denial. No voices, no static, no interference. Radios behaved normally again. Sleep came easier, but it wasn't restful. Every dream carried the same imagery. Dense foliage pressed too close. Visibility measured in inches, not meters. The sense of being watched from all directions at once. A week after redeployment, intelligence conducted final debriefs. Different officers this time. Different tone. They didn't ask what we heard. They asked what we felt. Did you experience disorientation? Did time seem distorted? Did you feel compelled to respond? Those questions told me more than any classified briefing could. One analyst slipped up during my session. He referenced previous containment failures before correcting himself and moving on. When I pressed, he shut down completely. The interview ended early. That night, alone in my new quarters, I finally listened to the recordings they hadn't confiscated. Personal audio. Low-quality snippets I'd captured early on, before command took control. The voices were faint, but unmistakable. What struck me most wasn't the fear or urgency. It was the discipline. Even trapped, even breaking down, Raven Platoon maintained formation in their speech. No panic, no chaos. Just soldiers adapting to conditions that no doctrine had prepared them for. Holding because that's what they'd been trained to do. 2 weeks later, I received an encrypted message from someone I hadn't spoken to since Samasan. One line only. They're quiet. That's worse. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. I started noticing small things after that. Radios turning on briefly at night, then off. A faint smell of damp soil after heavy rain. Even indoors. Once, during a field exercise thousands of miles away, I heard insects clicking in perfect rhythm through my headset for exactly 6 seconds before the channel cleared. When I reported it, the response was immediate and rehearsed. No correlation established. They were watching for it, waiting. Months later, I learned through unofficial channels that Barracks C-12 had been entombed, not demolished, encased. Concrete poured into every access point, every conduit, every crack. Ground-penetrating scans reportedly showed nothing inside afterward. No rooms, no voids, just solid mass where a building used to be. The report concluded the site was inert. That word bothered me. Inert implies something that could be active again. I thought about Raven 3-1's last transmission. We'll hold. That's what we do. It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like reassurance. Like someone standing watch so others don't have to. That's when the question I'd been avoiding finally surfaced. What happens if they can't hold anymore? Raven Platoon wasn't extracted. They weren't killed in action in any traditional sense. They were assigned a mission without end, against something that learned by observing human behavior. A presence that used isolation, terrain, and time as weapons. And they were still there. Not in Laos, not in Thailand. Somewhere overlapping us just enough to hear our radios, feel our movement, and know when we were leaving. The jungle didn't need bodies to win. It only needed patience. I requested reassignment shortly after. Not out of fear, but out of certainty. I didn't want to be near signals work anymore. Didn't want to be the one who heard the call when it came back. Because I know now that silence isn't proof of absence. It's proof of discipline. Raven Platoon learned that whatever had taken them responded to attention, to acknowledgement, to engagement. So they adapted the only way soldiers know how. They went quiet. Sometimes, late at night, I still imagine a radio crackling to life somewhere deep in concrete and earth. A voice steady, tired, and professional, calling into darkness, requesting orders that will never come. And I wonder how many other places like Barracks C-12 exist. How many sealed buildings? How many quiet frequencies? How many units listed as lost that are actually still on mission, holding something back because someone has to? Wars don't always end when the shooting stops. Some of them just go dark, and the men fighting them never get to come home. Chapter 7. Only their radios came back. Years have passed since Camp San, but some missions don't respect rotation schedules. They follow you quietly, showing up in places you don't expect, at moments when your guard is down. For me, it came back during a routine equipment audit at a stateside facility, the kind of place where nothing ever happens. And that's exactly how Command likes it. I was overseeing a batch of decommissioned radios slated for disposal. Old models. Obsolete encryption. Most of them hadn't been powered on in decades. As I signed off on serial numbers, one unit caught my eye. Scratched casing. Faded stencil marks. A name etched lightly near the battery compartment. Raven 3-1. I told myself it was coincidence. There are only so many call signs in the world. Still, my hand lingered on that radio longer than it should have. Against protocol, I inserted a battery and turned it on. It powered up immediately. No boot delay. No error tones. The display flickered once, then stabilized on a frequency that didn't exist in any modern allocation table. Before I could shut it down, the speaker crackled softly. "Radio check," a familiar voice said. "Anybody up there?" The room felt smaller all at once. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Every lesson learned at C-12 came rushing back. Engagement meant acknowledgement. Acknowledgement meant invitation. I removed the battery with shaking hands and secured the radio in a Faraday container meant for damaged equipment. Later that day, I reported the incident. The response was immediate and unsettlingly calm. The radio was confiscated. The audit was terminated. I was reminded, politely but firmly, that some equipment carries legacy risks best handled above my pay grade. That phrase again. Legacy risks. I did some digging on my own after that. Quiet inquiries. Old contacts. People who owed favors and didn't ask why I needed them. What I found confirmed what I already suspected. Raven Platoon wasn't unique. They were just the first documented case. Across different theaters, different eras, different wars, there were scattered reports of units that vanished under conditions that didn't fit enemy action. Jungles, mountains, urban ruins, places where terrain itself seemed to turn hostile in ways that defied conventional explanation. In almost every case, one detail repeated. The radios were recovered, sometimes stacked, sometimes buried, sometimes found miles from the last known position, still transmitting faint signals long after batteries should have died. Voices calling for orders, for extraction, for confirmation that someone was still listening. Command classified these incidents under different labels. Environmental anomaly, psychological warfare exposure, signal echo phenomena, whatever made them easier to file away and forget. But the soldiers who handled the reports knew better. These weren't echoes. They were holdovers. Men and women caught in spaces where the rules bent just enough to trap them between mission parameters and reality. Places where attention fed something patient and adaptive. Something that learned how soldiers move, think, and communicate. And once it learned you, it didn't need you anymore. Raven Platoon figured that out too late. Or maybe just in time. By holding their position, by staying disciplined even in silence, they became a barrier. A fixed point that kept whatever they encountered from spreading further, from learning faster, from crossing completely. Only their radios came back because radios are how soldiers reach out. Bodies anchor you to a place. Signals don't. That's the part Command never writes down. Sometimes, when I think about Raven 3-1, I don't imagine him lost in a jungle anymore. I imagine him standing watch in a space that doesn't have geography, holding a perimeter measured in frequencies and shadows, listening for calls he knows he shouldn't answer, because answering would mean letting something else through. I've stopped working with communications equipment now. Chose a different path. Less noise. Less chance of being the one who hears the call when discipline finally breaks. But I know this much. If you ever hear a voice on a dead channel using old call signs and perfect procedure, don't answer it. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Because whoever is on the other end isn't asking for help anymore. They're holding the line. And as long as they do, the rest of us get to believe that some wars are really over.